The first thing I noticed was the sound. Not the hammering itself. Not the backup beeper from the contractor's truck. Not even the circular saw biting through lumber in clean, practiced bursts. It was the confidence behind all of it. The kind of noise people make when they believe they are standing exactly where they're supposed to be. I killed my engine at the edge of the dirt access road and just sat there for a moment, one hand still on the steering wheel, looking through the windshield at a house being built on my land. The foundation had already cured. Framing was up. Exterior walls were outlined in pale timber against a washed-out afternoon sky. Bundles of shingles sat stacked near the slab. Someone had spray-painted utility marks in bright orange arcs across the dirt. A portable toilet leaned slightly in the wind beside a dumpster half full of cutoffs and cardboard. I remember how still I felt. People like to imagine anger arrives first. It doesn't always. Sometimes it's silence. Sometimes it's the mind refusing to process what the eyes are reporting. I knew the parcel lines. I knew the acreage. I knew the legal description so well I could have recited most of it from memory. That framed structure should not have existed. Not there. Not on that side of the drainage swale. Not 50 feet past the old live oak marker and directly inside the southern third of my 2.7-acre parcel. A worker in a reflective vest glanced toward my truck, then looked away. To him, I was just another late-arriving subcontractor or maybe a neighbor curious about progress. He had no reason to think he was helping commit a six-figure mistake. I stepped out and walked toward the slab. Dry clay crunched under my boots. The smell of fresh pine and wet concrete hung in the air. There was a sightboard posted near the entrance with permit information in a plastic sleeve. Lot designation. Model name. Builder. Estimated completion date. The lot number meant nothing to me. That was the first cold detail that landed cleanly in my mind. They weren't building by deed. They were building by assumption. I took out my phone and started recording. Slow pan. Framing. Site board. Temporary power pole. Workers. Materials. Neighboring fence line. Then I turned the camera down toward the dirt where the old survey pin should have been visible if anyone had bothered to locate it. It had been buried under tire tracks. A man in a white hard hat emerged from the framed opening that would become the front door. He asked if he could help me. I asked him who authorized the build. He gave me the name of the Homeowners Association, then said the president had signed off after confirming the lot was part of their expansion reserve. Expansion reserve. The phrase was almost elegant in its laziness. I asked him whether anyone had ordered a boundary survey before excavation. He hesitated, then said the plans came from the association and the county had accepted the permit package. He was already shifting into defensive language, the kind professionals use when they sense risk but don't yet know the size of it. I told him, carefully, that this property was mine. He smiled in the way people do when they believe they are humoring a misunderstanding. Then he said, "If that's true, you should probably talk to the HOA." Probably. I stood there with the late sun flattening the whole scene into harsh gold and shadow, looking at a half-built house that had no legal right to exist. And in that moment I understood two things with perfect clarity. First, someone had made a catastrophic assumption. Second, they had already gone too far to admit it casually. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and this is the story of how an HOA built a house on land they never owned, then spent months trying to convince everyone, including me, that I was the one in the wrong. I didn't buy the land on impulse. Nothing about that purchase was emotional, and that was exactly why it mattered. 6 years earlier, suburban expansion had started pressing outward from the city in a slow, predictable wave. First came the widened roads. Then the utilities. Then the monument signs with optimistic names: Oak Crest, Willow Ridge, Park Hollow, each one promising curated peace on land that had been scrub and pasture a year before. I'd watched that movement long enough to understand its pattern. The profits were rarely in the finished homes. They were in the edges. The parcels just outside certainty. The land people ignored until growth reached for it. My 2.7 acres sat exactly there. It wasn't dramatic land. No river frontage. No panoramic bluff. Just a quiet, undeveloped parcel at the edge of an older county tract, where the last pieces of unclaimed geography were being surrounded by master-planned neighborhoods and decorative stone walls. Most people drove past it and saw weeds, brush, a drainage cut, and an awkward shape. I saw timing. I work in commercial risk assessment. My job, in simple terms, is to examine what other people overlook until it costs them money. That mindset doesn't switch off when I leave the office. So when I first saw the parcel listed through a small local broker, I didn't picture a dream home or a quick flip. I pictured optionality. Hold it. Improve access later. Sell when utilities pushed closer. Or keep it and build when the surrounding density made privacy expensive. But land only looks simple from a distance. Up close, it's paperwork. So I spent 6 months doing due diligence. I pulled tax maps, then ignored them because tax maps are useful only until they aren't. I ordered title work. I traced the chain of title backward through recorded deeds, easements, corrections, and a minor probate transfer from decades earlier. I compared the legal description in the seller's deed against the county plat and the meets and bounds references in older records. I checked whether the parcel had ever been annexed into a homeowners association. It had not. I confirmed that twice, from 2 different sources, because HOAs have a habit of assuming influence where no legal authority exists. Then I hired an independent surveyor before closing. Not after. Before. He spent 2 days on site. He located the original monuments that still existed, set reference stakes, and produced a clean boundary survey that showed exactly what I needed to know. The parcel had legal access by recorded easement, enough usable build area outside the drainage restrictions, and a title history that was unusually clean for land sitting this close to active development. That last part was the hidden strength. The surrounding subdivision had changed hands more than once during phased development. Some maps floating around locally showed my parcel as if it were an eventual future amenity reserve or open tract. But those were planning visuals, not ownership documents. Somewhere along the line, conceptual drawings had started living in people's heads as fact. My survey and title report made clear that the parcel had never transferred to the developer, never entered the HOA, and never became common property. That distinction would later become everything. Financially, it made sense. I bought below what I believed would be long-term value, paid cash, and carried the land without stress. No debt pressure. No forced timeline. Just taxes, brush control twice a year, and patience. I visited every few months, sometimes just to walk the lines and make sure no one had dumped debris or moved markers. I wasn't sentimental about it, but I respected it. There's a difference. People think ownership is abstract until they hold a deed to raw ground. Then it becomes surprisingly physical. The slope of the soil matters. The drainage path matters. The exact bend of a tree line matters. Your rights are written on paper, but they live in the dirt. For the first 2 years, the parcel behaved exactly the way I wanted it to. Quiet. Stable. Boring. Then the subdivision next door elected Dianne Kellner to her 11th year as HOA president, and boring became expensive. The first time I walked the property after closing, it was early morning in late fall. The air had that dry metallic chill that disappears as soon as the sun gets serious. There was dew on the grass in the lower section, and the brush along the eastern edge still held little beads of moisture that flashed when the light caught them. I parked near the access point and stepped through waist-high growth, following the line my surveyor had shown me. Undeveloped land reveals itself slowly. It doesn't announce value. You have to read grade, drainage, setback constraints, neighboring improvements, road orientation, utility proximity. You have to imagine how a site behaves in rain, in heat, in 10 years of surrounding construction. I remember stopping near the slight rise in the center of the parcel and turning in a full circle. To the west, the subdivision's roofs were visible beyond a berm and a row of ornamental trees. To the north, newer roads were pushing outward, fresh curbs still pale against disturbed soil. To the south, the land fell just enough to create separation without losing utility. And to the east, there was open county ground that would eventually develop but not immediately. It was, in plain terms, the kind of parcel that becomes more valuable simply because other people run out of room. What most people would have called a flaw was what made it strong. The shape was irregular, but not unbuildable. In fact, that irregularity insulated the most usable section from casual encroachment because anyone relying on outdated subdivision exhibits instead of an actual survey would assume the boundary ran in a cleaner line than it did. The southwest corner bowed outward more than the neighborhood maps suggested. On paper, it looked minor. On the ground, it created a surprisingly large area of legally buildable land. That was the hidden legal advantage. The parcel didn't just exist outside the HOA. It existed in a way that punished lazy assumptions. I kept every file from the purchase. Survey, title commitment, closing packet, tax receipts, county correspondence, utility notes, even photos of the original markers. Some people call that overkill. I call it insulation. When you own something simple, records are optional. When you own something near people who believe expansion is destiny, records are oxygen. Over time, I started seeing the surrounding development gather confidence. New entrance signs went up. Sidewalks appeared. Decorative fencing edged closer. The HOA newsletters, publicly posted online, which was useful, started talking about future continuity of the community landscape and long-term integration opportunities. They wrote like people who believed the area around them was unfinished until it looked like them. I visited the parcel less for inspection and more for calibration. I wanted to see how pressure was forming around it. Were people cutting across it? Dumping branches? Extending irrigation beyond their lots? Small behaviors tell you what larger ones are coming. The first real sign came as tire tracks. Nothing dramatic. Just a pair of fresh, deep grooves crossing near the north edge where no vehicle had any business being. A week later I found a cluster of temporary utility flags well inside my boundary, then removed them and documented the location. After that came a stack of silt fence material left near the drainage line. Again, I photographed it and moved it out. Individually, these were minor intrusions. Together, they formed a pattern I recognized immediately. Someone was preparing ground they didn't understand. There's a very specific kind of dread that comes from seeing a legal problem before it fully arrives. It's like smelling smoke without finding flames. You know you are still early. You also know early doesn't last. So I started checking county permit filings. Quietly. Methodically. I found references to a reserve lot activation tied to the adjacent subdivision. Then a model permit application. Then a site plan attachment that used a lot configuration inconsistent with my recorded survey. It wasn't just carelessness anymore. It was momentum. That was the day I ordered a fresh survey. Not because I doubted my ownership. Because I wanted the next document in the chain to be current, indisputable, and impossible to dismiss as stale. I wanted someone with a license and a timestamp standing between me and whatever fantasy the HOA had constructed. When the surveyor called 2 weeks later, he didn't sound surprised. He sounded tired. He said, "Ethan, if they build where these permit coordinates suggest, they'll be fully on your land." Fully. Not partially encroaching. Not clipping a setback. Not over a line by a fence post. Fully on my land. And 3 weeks after that, I drove out there and found a foundation. I didn't call the police. People always ask that first. Why didn't you just call the police and stop it right there? Because land disputes are civil until they become something else, and uniform certainty doesn't override recorded title. I needed paper, not adrenaline. So I moved in order. I left the site without arguing with the workers. On the drive home, I called the surveyor and asked him to meet me there the next morning for field verification. Then I called a real estate attorney I'd used once on a commercial easement matter. Not because he specialized in drama, but because he specialized in documents that survive it. By noon the next day, we had confirmation. The foundation and framing weren't close to my boundary. They were planted deep inside it. When the crew had scraped and poured, they'd ignored the actual track lines entirely and relied on an internal lot exhibit tied to HOA expansion planning. In other words, they had built a house on a parcel they wished existed, not the parcel the law recognized. My attorney asked the obvious question. Had anyone ever approached me about sale, easement, annexation, or boundary adjustment? No. No offer. No negotiation. No notice. Nothing. That changed the nature of the thing. If someone builds across a line after a failed negotiation, the dispute may be ugly, but it's at least honest. This wasn't honest. This was a group of people acting as though ownership would sort itself out later. That afternoon, we sent the first cease and desist. Immediate demand to halt all work. Notice of ownership. Survey attached. Warning that continued construction constituted willful trespass and encroachment. Copies went to the HOA, the builder, the permitting office, and the association's registered agent. The builder responded first, and exactly how I expected. Polite. Alarmed. Distancing. They claimed they had relied on representations made by the HOA regarding ownership and development authority. They said they were reviewing the matter. Translation: they had just discovered the ground under their boots was a legal minefield. The HOA did not respond. Instead, work continued for another day and a half. That decision told me more than any letter could have. A mistake stops when it is revealed. Negligence continues because ego is expensive to reverse. I returned to the site on the second day after the cease and desist and found siding materials delivered and stacked. The framing crew was still active. I recorded everything again and sent the footage to my attorney. We drafted the construction halt request and prepared an encroachment action alongside a quiet title filing, because I already understood the strategy forming on the other side. They were not going to admit error quickly. They were going to muddy ownership, question boundaries, and hope cost or fatigue softened me. They had chosen the wrong parcel owner for that approach. What made the land valuable now was exactly what made the case strong. My ownership history was clean, continuous, documented, and outside the HOA's legal reach. There was no ambiguous annexation vote. No lost easement. No handshake agreement. No permissive use. No member obligation. Just a deed, a survey, county records, and a structure rising where it had no lawful right to stand. But documents alone don't change people. They corner them. And cornered people tend to introduce themselves. That was when Dianne Kellner finally called me. Her voice was composed in the way some people mistake for authority. No greeting beyond my first name. No acknowledgement that her organization had started constructing a house on land she didn't own. She spoke as if there had been a clerical inconvenience between two competent adults. She asked if I could meet on site to clear up a mapping discrepancy. A mapping discrepancy. I agreed immediately. Because if someone is willing to minimize a disaster before they know what you have, you should let them keep talking. Dianne Kellner arrived in a white SUV that looked too clean for the road leading to the parcel. She stepped out wearing a pressed navy blouse, sunglasses, and the kind of expression that had probably ended a lot of conversations before they started. She had the posture of a person who had spent years mistaking procedural control for ownership. Behind her came a younger man carrying a folder and a builder representative I recognized from the site. Dianne had been HOA president for 11 years. I knew that by then, and I knew more than that. I had read meeting minutes, newsletters, design committee updates, vendor disputes, every public trace I could find. She had cultivated a reputation as the woman who kept standards high, which is often suburban code for selective enforcement wrapped in manicured landscaping. Under her leadership, the association had expanded amenities, revised covenants, pressured adjacent owners, and floated multiple future integration ideas about surrounding parcels. She didn't just run the HOA. She performed permanence. She shook my hand without warmth and looked past me at the framing. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I think this is much less complicated than your attorney is making it." That was her first real sentence to me, and it contained the full architecture of her method: minimize, isolate, discredit. I told her complexity was not the issue. Title was. She smiled faintly, as if indulging a technical mind missing the larger picture. Then she nodded to the younger man, who handed me the folder. Inside was a prepared agreement already signed on the HOA side. Not a draft. Not notes. A finished instrument. It proposed that I acknowledge historical uncertainty in parcel boundary alignment, grant temporary construction access, waive interference claims during a review period, and enter negotiations for either a boundary adjustment or sale at a price to be determined by later appraisal. Buried in the middle was language that could be used to argue I had acquiesced to their possession and waived immediate injunctive relief. In plain language, Dianne had arrived with a pre-signed document designed to launder trespass into negotiation. I stood there reading while the wind moved through the open framing behind us. Nails glinted in the boards. Somewhere inside the structure, a compressor kicked on and hissed. You came prepared, I said. We're trying to avoid unnecessary conflict, she replied. No, I said, still looking at the page. You're trying to preserve an illegal build long enough to improve your leverage. The builder representative looked down. Dianne didn't flinch. This parcel has appeared as part of community reserve on planning materials for years. Planning materials aren't deeds. The county accepted the permit. The county doesn't convey title. Her sunglasses hid her eyes, but her mouth tightened. That was the first crack. People who rely on institutional fog don't enjoy clear sentences. She shifted tactics. She said the association had invested substantial funds based on long-standing assumptions. She said multiple families were counting on housing expansion. She said stopping construction would create reputational harm and financial waste. She said it would be unfortunate if a simple misunderstanding became adversarial. That was the moment she finally looked at me the way she should have from the beginning, not as a confused outsider, but as an obstacle. I handed the agreement back and signed. There is no misunderstanding, I said. You built on land you don't own. Construction stops now. If you continue after notice, every dollar you spend deepens your liability. The younger man took the folder without meeting my eyes. Dianne removed her sunglasses then, slowly, and I saw exactly what I expected. Not panic, but offense. The offense of someone unaccustomed to refusal. She asked whether I was really prepared to delay housing over what she called a technical parcel dispute. I told her property rights are made of technicalities. That's why they survive people like her. For a few seconds, none of us spoke. The worksite behind us had gone strangely quiet, as if even the crews could feel the conversation hardening. Then Dianne said she would have counsel review my position. My position. I remember that phrase clearly because it revealed her last remaining hope. She still believed this was a contest of narratives. She had not yet accepted that she was standing inside a fact pattern. As she turned to leave, I said one more thing. Dianne, if this foundation gets another board attached after today, I'm not negotiating from inconvenience. I'm litigating from intentional encroachment. She paused, then gave me a look people use when they plan to punish confidence later. What she did not understand was that punishment only works if the other person is afraid of escalation. I was waiting for it. The first letter from the HOA's attorney arrived 2 days later. It was heavy on tone, light on substance, and built around an argument so weak it almost impressed me. They claimed the parcel had been treated by the community and its predecessors as integrated reserve property for years and suggested that historical use, planning reliance, and equitable considerations justified a negotiated resolution that would preserve the structure. Equitable considerations. That phrase appears when the law is bad and somebody hopes sympathy can fill the gap. My attorney answered with the kind of clarity that makes bad faith expensive. He attached the deed, the updated survey, the original title work, tax payment records in my name, the county parcel record, and photographs showing active construction after notice. He demanded an immediate halt, preservation of all internal communications related to parcel identification, and confirmation that no further improvements, sales representations, or financing activity would occur on the structure. Then we filed. Quiet title action first, to eliminate any manufactured ambiguity. Then the encroachment lawsuit. Then the request for injunctive relief to stop construction and prevent transfer, marketing, or occupancy. We were no longer asking the HOA to behave responsibly. We were asking the court to lock the doors before they could compound the mistake. And that was when the social pressure began. I started receiving emails from addresses I didn't recognize. Some were civil. Most were not. Neighbors accused me of holding up progress. One said I was trying to extort the community. Another asked whether I enjoyed suing families. A third informed me, with great suburban moral confidence, that everyone knows that tract belongs with the neighborhood. Everyone knows. There is no phrase more dangerous in property disputes than a collective myth spoken with enough repetition. Someone posted in the HOA's resident forum that I was an absentee investor trying to block a planned home after the community had maintained the land for years. That was false. The land had not been maintained by the HOA, unless you count unauthorized flags, tire tracks, and trespass. But falsehood moves faster when it flatters the audience. I wasn't a person with a deed. I was a useful villain in a story they preferred. Dianne, I noticed, never posted directly under her own name. She didn't need to. Her fingerprints were in the phrasing. The same language from her letters began appearing in resident chatter: reserve parcel, historical alignment, community expectation, shared development vision. She had built a narrative scaffold just as confidently as she had built the house. Then the complaints started. A county code inquiry about vegetation. A drainage concern. An access use review. None of them serious. All of them timed. It was the administrative equivalent of pebbles thrown at a window. Annoying, deniable, meant to signal that resisting the HOA would not remain contained. I answered everything. Quietly. Completely. Documentation makes harassment boring, and boring is lethal to people who want reaction. The builder, meanwhile, had frozen major work but not fully demobilized. Materials remained on site. Tools came and went. At least once, workers returned long enough to wrap exposed sections against weather. Technically protective. Practically continued possession. We documented each instance. Emotionally, that month was colder than I expected. Not because I doubted the outcome. I didn't. But because there is something uniquely invasive about watching strangers discuss your property as if your ownership is a social inconvenience. I would sit at my kitchen table at night with records spread in neat rows and feel a controlled, private anger settle in. Not explosive anger. Something sharper. The kind that makes you more organized. I stopped explaining myself to anyone outside counsel. I stopped reading resident comments except when we needed screenshots. I stopped imagining Dianne as merely overreaching. She had crossed beyond error and into maintenance of error. That matters. Negligence is sloppy. Ongoing negligence becomes strategy. At one point, her attorney floated a purchase idea through back channels. Not a real offer. Just a numberless suggestion that reasonable compensation might be available if I recognized the practical realities. I told my attorney to respond with practical realities of our own, demolition or compensation sufficient to cover fair market value, loss of use, legal fees, trespass damages, and any measurable diminution or carrying impact caused by their conduct. In other words, I was not going to donate leverage because they had framed walls faster than they checked title. The next morning I drove by before sunrise. The house stood skeletal and gray in the half-light, wrapped in silence for the first time since I'd found it. Mist sat low over the lower drainage strip. A line of orange survey flags I had placed with my surveyor fluttered along the edge like warnings no one wanted to read. That was when I knew the fight had shifted. The construction was obvious. The ownership was provable. What I needed next was intent. Intent is what separates a costly mistake from a devastating case. Up to that point, the HOA could still try to perform innocence. They could claim outdated maps, vendor confusion, county misunderstanding, inherited assumptions. Those excuses were weak, but they existed. If I wanted real damages, if I wanted the court to see not just encroachment, but negligent disregard, I needed evidence showing that the truth had been available and ignored. So I widened the circle of collection. We subpoenaed permit communications. Internal HOA meeting materials related to the so-called expansion reserve. Emails with the builder. Any survey, plat, title review, or consultant note used before construction. The county's file was helpful immediately. Buried in an attachment log was a rejected preliminary site exhibit flagged by a staff reviewer with a note requesting boundary confirmation because parcel ownership appeared inconsistent with tax and GIS records. The final approved package had replaced that exhibit with a cleaned-up version and no independent boundary certification. That was not proof of fraud, but it was proof of a warning. Then we obtained something better. The builder produced correspondence showing they had asked the HOA, in writing, whether a current boundary survey should be commissioned before foundation work because the lot shape differed from legacy planning materials. Dianne's response was short. She wrote that the parcel had been reviewed internally for years, that a new survey would be an unnecessary delay, and that the association was comfortable proceeding under existing development mapping. Comfortable proceeding. There are sentences that look almost harmless until you place them next to a concrete slab on someone else's property. My attorney read the email twice, then looked at me over the top of the printout and said, That's negligence in business casual. But the case still had another problem: optics. Dianne was telling residents that the association was defending community assets against a speculative landowner trying to profit from confusion. Legally, it didn't matter much. Practically, it mattered enough. Judges live in law. Cases live in atmospheres. And Dianne was trying to thicken the air. So I became patient. I installed legal trail cameras on my side of the property boundary and repositioned them to cover the access route and the area near the original markers. I did not announce it. I simply let time do what pressure always does: reveal habit. The footage began paying off within days. One evening, after most of the crews had cleared out, 2 men came onto the parcel in an HOA-branded pickup. One carried a bundle of small stakes. The other had a mallet. They walked to the edge where my survey flags and temporary markers defined the actual line, spoke briefly, then set several new stakes about 30 feet west, toward the HOA lots. False markers. Clean, deliberate, meant to visually shift the boundary for anyone casually walking the site. They worked quickly, efficiently, not like confused people, like people correcting a scene. I watched the footage 3 times. At the end, the passenger turned toward the truck and I got a clear side profile. It was the younger man who had handed me the pre-signed agreement at my meeting with Dianne. We preserved the footage immediately. That alone was powerful. But I didn't move on it yet. Strategic patience is not passivity. It's the decision to let someone finish assembling the shape of their own liability. If I confronted them too early, they would retreat into error and confusion. If I waited, they would keep building a record. And they did. A week later, another camera captured a survey flag near the southwest line being pulled and discarded. Then came audio from a separate device picking up a conversation between 2 subcontractors wondering why the owner guy kept saying the lot wasn't theirs when Dianne already told us legal cleared it. Small things. Not decisive alone. But together they formed pattern, instruction, awareness. Emotionally, this was the phase that tested me most. Not because I was losing, but because I was watching dishonesty become operational. It is one thing to be wrong. It is another to organize around staying wrong. I kept my routine. Work. Calls with counsel. Evidence logs at night. Site visits at controlled intervals. I slept less, but not worse. Precision has its own kind of calm. Every document collected reduced the range of their escape. Then notice went out for the HOA's monthly community meeting. Buried in the agenda was an item labeled Reserve Parcel Litigation Update and Funding Authorization. That was the moment I'd been waiting for. Because if Dianne intended to sell this narrative to her residents and secure association money to keep fighting, she would have to say the lie aloud. And I intended to be in the room when she did. The meeting was held in the clubhouse, a low stone building near the neighborhood pool, designed in the way suburban common spaces always are, meant to look formal enough to imply governance, soft enough to disguise conflict. I arrived early, sat near the back, and kept a small digital recorder in my jacket pocket even though the meeting itself was also being captured under the association's standard procedure. Redundancy matters. Residents filtered in with the rustling energy of people who had been preloaded with partial information. I recognized some from screenshots of the forum posts. A few looked at me and then looked away. Others stared longer than politeness allows. No one approached. Dianne stood at the front beside a projection screen, papers arranged in clean stacks, expression composed. She knew I was there before the meeting started. I could tell by the fraction of a second her eyes paused on me when she entered. But she did not acknowledge me publicly. Control was her native language, and surprise was not part of the script. They moved through landscaping contracts, pool maintenance, a fence variance request. Ordinary HOA business. Then, with almost theatrical calm, Dianne introduced the litigation item. She told the room the association was defending long-recognized community reserve land against a private claimant who had surfaced after years of non-participation to challenge a planned housing addition. She said the title issue was complex, the boundaries historically inconsistent, and the association's legal position strong. Then she recommended authorizing further expenditure of association funds to continue defense and preserve the nearly completed structure. Nearly completed. It wasn't, but the inflation was deliberate. The more finished the house sounded, the more unreasonable I would seem. Then came the emotional lever. She said walking away now would reward opportunism and force the community to absorb unnecessary loss. There it was. Not legal reasoning. Moral inversion. A resident asked whether the association had commissioned a new survey before building. Dianne answered that the board had relied on existing development records and prior confirmations sufficient for commencement. Prior confirmations. A phrase broad enough to sound responsible, vague enough to avoid detail. Another resident asked whether the parcel owner had ever been approached before construction. Dianne said there had been no practical reason to believe separate outreach was necessary. I felt the room shift slightly on that sentence. Some people heard it and nodded because they trusted tone over content. Others heard what it actually meant. When the floor opened for comments, I stood. No theatrics. No raised voice. I gave my name and stated that I was the recorded owner of the 2.7-acre parcel on which the association had built without consent. I said the deed, title chain, tax records, and current license survey all confirmed that ownership. I said the association had been given written notice before construction continued. I said I had evidence that updated boundary confirmation had been suggested and rejected, and evidence that site markers had later been moved. The room went absolutely still. Dianne tried to interrupt and call my remarks litigation framing, but one of the residents, a man in his 60s with the tired face of someone who had served on too many committees, asked a direct question. Did the board know there was no current survey? That was the moment. Not because Dianne answered poorly. Because she answered carefully. She said, the board acted in good faith based on the information it believed reliable at the time. Believed reliable. Not had. Not verified. Believed. The distinction was surgical, and it was fatal. I watched several people in the room react at once. Eyebrows lifted. Heads turned. One woman near the aisle looked down at her copy of the budget packet as if hoping the paper itself might explain what she had just heard. Dianne kept speaking, trying to recover momentum, but the authority had thinned. Once people realize a leader has been substituting confidence for proof, every polished sentence starts sounding borrowed. I didn't say everything I had. I didn't mention the email. I didn't mention the trail footage. Strategic patience again. The goal wasn't to win the room emotionally. It was to lock the board's public position before disclosure. They voted anyway. By a narrow margin, the HOA authorized additional legal funding, which meant the residents had now been formally induced to spend association money on a defense built on unverified ownership claims. That widened exposure. And it happened on the record. When the meeting ended, several residents avoided looking at Dianne as they left. A few looked at me with something between suspicion and concern. One man quietly asked whether the board had really built the house without confirming title. I told him he should request the documents from the association. He gave a dry, humorless laugh and said, "If those exist." I drove home that night with the meeting audio copied in duplicate and a feeling I can only describe as clean acceleration. The emotional part of the case was finally catching up to the legal part. Dianne had stopped managing a misunderstanding. Now she was preserving a lie with other people's money. The next morning my attorney and I spread the entire case across a conference table. Deed. Survey old and new. Title commitment. Tax history. Permit file. County reviewer note requesting boundary confirmation. Builder email asking whether to commission a current survey. Dianne's reply declining it as an unnecessary delay. Photos of construction after cease and desist. Trail camera stills of false stakes being placed. Meeting transcript excerpts. Resident vote authorizing more funding after materially incomplete representations. When you see a case assembled physically, it changes texture. It stops feeling like conflict and starts feeling like architecture. Every document supports load. Every contradiction has a place. Every excuse loses oxygen. We adjusted strategy in 3 directions. First, we strengthened the quiet title action with a request for expedited clarification based on the fully documented chain and absence of any competing recorded interest from the HOA. Second, we sharpened the encroachment claim into explicit negligence and knowing continuation after notice, tying post-notice activity to damages. Third, we issued a final demand. Demolition or compensation plus damages. Not a symbolic demand. A real one. If they wanted to remove the structure and restore the parcel, we would discuss conditions, timelines, and reimbursement. If they wanted to preserve any possibility of keeping improvements in place through purchase or court-ordered resolution, the number would reflect fair land value, loss of exclusive use, trespass, legal fees, expert costs, and the financial consequences of their conduct, not just the dirt under the slab. Either path would be expensive. That was appropriate. Cheap lessons do not correct this kind of behavior. The demand package went out before noon. Dianne's side requested time. We gave them almost none. Calm confidence in litigation is often just disciplined timing. If you allow people drowning in a bad record too much room, they spend it inventing fog. So we pressed hearing dates, objected to delay, and forced responses into the light. At the preliminary hearing on the construction halt request, the judge asked a question that cut through weeks of narrative in under 10 seconds. "Counsel," he said to the HOA's attorney, "what recorded instrument conveys this parcel to your client?" There was a pause. The attorney referenced planning documents, historical treatment, and community maps. The judge asked again, "What recorded instrument conveys title?" There wasn't one. Everyone in the room knew it then, if they hadn't before. The halt order followed. No further construction. No marketing. No transfer. No occupancy. Preservation of records. Site access protocols. It was not the final ruling, but it was the moment the case stopped being socially debatable and became legally vertical. The house stood frozen on my land like an admission made of timber and nails. I remember walking out of the courthouse feeling almost nothing at first. Relief is often delayed when you've spent too long in precision. But later that night, alone at home, I sat in the darkened kitchen and allowed myself one quiet minute to feel it. Not triumph. Recognition. The system had finally forced the facts to speak in a room where tone no longer mattered. The final proceedings came weeks later. By then discovery had done its work. The HOA's internal file showed no title opinion supporting ownership. No commissioned boundary survey before construction. No valid annexation record. Just assumptions, recycled maps, and confidence. Worse, emails showed Dianne had been warned more than once that the parcel status needed verification before the project moved forward. She moved forward anyway. That was negligence. Not abstractly. Provably. The courtroom was smaller than people imagine when they hear stories like this. No dramatic gallery, no cinematic thunder. Just wood, light, paper, and a judge with very little patience for avoidable stupidity. By the time the ruling came, the issue of ownership was almost insultingly clear. The court found the parcel 100% mine. Not partially. Not equitably shared. Not historically integrated. Mine. The quiet title claim succeeded cleanly, and the HOA's defenses collapsed under the absence of any recorded interest. Then came the language that mattered most to me. The court found the HOA's conduct negligent, specifically noting failure to verify land ownership before construction, disregard of available title information, continuation of work after notice, and reliance on outdated planning materials in place of competent legal and survey review. In practical terms, the judge said what I had known from the first day at the site. This house existed because people in authority preferred assumption to verification. On damages, the numbers were substantial. Compensation for trespass and encroachment. Recovery of attorney's fees and litigation costs. Survey and expert expenses. Additional damages tied to loss of use and the financial impact of the prolonged dispute. In total, the HOA was ordered to pay more than $300,000. The structure itself became leverage, not victory. They could not simply leave it there and hope time normalized it. They had to resolve the physical intrusion under terms shaped by the ruling. And once the money landed where consequences become real, reserve accounts, special assessments, insurance questions, angry residents, Dianne's control began to evaporate. She resigned less than 2 weeks later. Not with an apology. People like Dianne rarely arrive at apology. She issued a statement about the strain of ongoing community division and a desire to allow fresh leadership to move forward. It read exactly the way failure sounds when filtered through self-protection. But resignation was not the whole consequence. Residents who had trusted the board learned their dues had funded a legal disaster that basic due diligence could have prevented. The builder distanced itself publicly. Homeowners who once repeated Dianne's language about reserve land and opportunism started asking when the warnings had been ignored and why a current survey had been deemed too expensive before 6 figures in construction began. Her reputation didn't collapse in one dramatic second. It thinned, then tore. That's usually how it happens. Authority held together by confidence alone can survive disagreement. It cannot survive documents. As for me, I went back to the parcel after the ruling and walked it alone. The house still stood then, silent and stalled, a monument to other people's certainty. Wind moved through unfinished openings where windows would have been. The temporary wrap had loosened at one corner and flapped softly against the framing. Survey stakes marked the true lines in neat, indifferent color. The land itself looked exactly as it always had, patient, unpersuaded, beyond performance. I stood near the old oak marker and looked across the 2.7 acres I had bought because I believed quiet assets reward discipline. I had been right, though not in the way I expected. Property teaches a blunt lesson. If you do not know exactly what you own, someone else may decide they do. And if you do know, if you keep the records, verify the lines, and refuse to surrender fact to confidence, then even a half-built house can become evidence. So if you take anything from my story, let it be this. Know what's yours before someone with a title, a committee, and a polished voice decides your silence is permission. I'm Ethan Caldwell. And I'd be curious to know, if you found a house being built on your land, how long would it take before disbelief turned into action?